Okay, take it away, Laura.
Good evening to everybody. My name is Laura Mina. I'm the head librarian here at the Charleston Library Society. Dutch and I are coming to you from the Library Society, but here with us, I am totally honored and privileged to be able to introduce to you in person-ish Pamela Paul, editor of the New York Times Book Review and overseer of book coverage at the New York Times on the whole. Pamela Paul hosts the New York Times Book Review podcast, which is a weekly podcast that is available on your favorite podcatcher. She's the author of 6 books, and including most recently a book that's close to people's hearts, How to Raise a Reader. How to Raise a Reader and Pamela's forthcoming title, Rectangle Time, are both available for purchase through Buxton Books. We will put a link for those purchases in our chat. And we also have a very distinctive person joining us as well, named Dwight Garner. He is a book critic for the New York Times. He is also a book critic for the New York Times and a former senior editor of the New York Times Book Review, a longtime beloved contributor to an incredible array of publications, including, but not limited to, The Village Voice, Harper's Magazine, and Oxford American. Dwight's own forthcoming book, Garner's Quotations, a modern miscellany, will be out in November and is available for pre-purchase through Buxton Books this evening as well. So Pamela and Dwight, your voices have brought me a lot of peace over the course of this last year. And I had a critical moment early in the pandemic that carried me through as a parent and as a librarian. It was listening to the book review podcast from April 3rd, the episode's entitled Parenting When the Family is Locked Inside. And in that episode, the interview with clinical psychologist Lisa D'Amour was also coupled with you, Dwight, interviewing Pamela about putting together New York Times Book Review. It made me feel on some level that things would come back around. It also made me loop back to wondering, Pamela, whether we would still be able to have an event with you this October, because everything just felt so up in the air. And having an event that brought you here to Charleston in some way was near and dear to my heart. And when I heard the two of you in conversation in that interview, in that episode, it felt like the just right thing. And I'm sure that all of our audience tonight will agree. I'd love to be able to read to you some of the email that I had originally written to Pamela back in April of 2019, just so everybody understands the incredible role that the New York Times Book Review plays here at the Charleston Library Society. And it goes something like this. Dear Ms. Paul, this is a bit of a fan mail. Hopefully, you like fan mail. I turn to the New York Times Book Review and podcast on a weekly basis as one of my most important sources of information. Working at the Charleston Library Society, the second oldest circulating library in the country, I am lucky enough to help plan programs and purchase materials for our circulating collection. As a new mom, my time for reading collection development magazines is dramatically compromised. I've become quite picky about reviews I ingest, and the New York Times Book Review and podcast are my gold standards. If in a given week I only get to read one thing, I make sure it is hearing and reading what you and your team have to say. Without further ado, I bring you Dwight and Pamela. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Hi, Pamela.
Hey, Dwight.
What are you reading?
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, this is going to sound kind of crazy, but until recently, I was a deeply committed monogamous reader. I never read 2 books at the same time. And I only started doing it like in the last month. And I have to say, I don't know what took me so long. Now I never want to read just one book again. I don't see why I was so stuck on the notion that you should only read one thing at a time. I almost feel like I was a child until last month. I like reading more than one thing felt like breaking the rules. So I'm really happy now that I'm reading two things. I mean, the way I think about it is, it's like you can watch a TV show, right? You can be watching a series at the same time that you're reading a book. You can be involved in two different storylines at the same time. So I'm reading two things. That's a long way of saying. And they fulfill very different needs. I'm reading David Nassau's The Last Million, which is the story of the last million displaced persons in Europe, but at the end of the World War II and into the Cold War. David Nassau is most well known, I think, as the biographer of Andrew Carnegie. And I started reading the Andrew Carnegie book, and it's one of the few books that I stopped reading for no good reason. Well, the reason was, if I'm honest, I was pregnant at the time with my third child, and I had the baby. And after having the baby, I just couldn't go back to reading the Andrew Carnegie biography. So I picked up The Hunger Games instead. It was a little switch in mode based on sleep and other factors. Anyway, I do plan to go back to the Andrew Carnegie, but this is a departure for him in that it's not a biography, but it's a really interesting period in history and obviously has contemporary repercussions. It's interesting, for example, to be reading about the Jews and the sort of birth of or not the birth of Zionism, but really the point at which Zionism became a reality. We're talking about the 40s and into the founding of Israel in 1948. At the same time that you're reading news headlines about Ethiopian Jews trying to leave Ethiopia as refugees and come to Israel, and Israel's response was not to let all of them in. So it's very interesting on many levels. And the other book I'm reading is Tana French's Broken Harbor. So, and that's a thriller. She is an American writer living in Ireland. She writes this series called The Dublin Murder Squad. They're basically procedural / thrillers, but in a literary sort of vein. She's really good at character. And I started off by reading her two most recent books, and then decided I would go back to the beginning and start from the first one. So I'm in this sort of ongoing Tana French project.
And are you a fast reader?
No. I'm a really slow, very easily distracted reader, and nobody believes me, but if they watched me for 5 minutes reading, they would be like, I see your problem. Because I will sit down and read like 3 pages, and then I have to get up and walk across the room and do something. And I read very slowly, and I don't skim, and I'm always tired, so it slows me down. Are you a fast reader?
You can usually tell if you're going to like a book within the first 10, 15 pages.
I do, and I used to be much more of a completist. I've now gotten to the point where if I'm not in the mood for something, it's not necessarily that I won't like something. I tend to kind of know what I'm going to like. And so by the time a book comes to me, I sort of feel somewhat committed to it, whether I've purchased it or taken it home from work. But sometimes I'm just not in the mood for what I start. So I do start a lot of books and think like, this is good, but it's not good for me right now.
I've actually terrified myself this year because a couple of books that I would not have continued with, but I was going to review, and I really didn't like the first 75, even 100 pages, and they turned out to be terrific books, and it kind of scares me. It scares me because, as you know, you and I get so many books that we often have to judge whether we're going to write about something based on a 20-page, 30-page skim. And do you have that fear sometimes when you're trying to decide whether to review something for the book review? You can judge it based on...
I'm not the decider. I mean, it's interesting. The last time that I was the decider really about whether or not to review something was when I was the children's books editor, which is now 9 years ago. So I'm not making that decision of having to go through and determine whether to review something or not. Generally speaking, we have an amazing staff of editors, as you know, because you were once one of the editors. We didn't overlap in that regard. Although Dwight was an editor who assigned me book reviews when I was a freelancer before coming to the Times. So I'm not the one making those decisions, but
this might be a good chance to explain to the people watching how it works. I mean, how books do get assigned there. I mean, a writer writes it, a publisher publishes it, and then they send it where now? And how does a book get reviewed in the Times?
All right, so we're going to talk about, I'm going to describe this process as if we were not in the middle of a pandemic, all working from home. But once I describe it, I can then say, and now it all happens on in a database and a spreadsheet and on Kindles and, iPads and screens, and we don't like any of that in particular. But the process is this: the books come to us, and then we perform a kind of active triage. So there are multiple stages of triage. The first person to go through them throws a lot of things away. They throw away things that are self-published. They throw away things that are not categories that we would ordinarily review. We review almost everything, but I don't know, a paperback original Western novel, not that those are really published anymore, but I feel like even 10 years ago, you still got them occasionally. We don't really review those. So certain things sort of get, and I hate to say it, but if it's not a real book, it goes into a dumpster. If it is a real book, then we have a process, and we don't throw away real books at the book review, in case that's a concern for anyone. They go to a good place eventually. So once he's done that triage, then there's another series of triage that happens where 2 or 3 senior editors at the book review will go through the books that have made that cut, and they will throw away more, but the ones that they keep, they will give to our staff of what's called preview editors. And you as a senior editor were one of our preview editors back in the day. Now, how long does that ago now? 15 years ago?
12, 13.
Years. So those editors will then get really mail cartons, actually, full of books. We give them out every 2 or 3 weeks. And I think pretty quickly, and you can probably talk about this too, things get distilled into 3 piles. These are the things I know we're not going to do. These are the things I know we're going to want to assign for review. And here's the worst, middle part. I don't know. And you really have to kind of dig in to determine, is this debut collection of short stories going to make the cut or not? After that, you then decide, these are the ones that I want to review. The ones that you don't, you write up what's called a skip note, where it's a very, very short, deeply negative review. Sometimes it'll just say, this is about agrarian farming in, Normandy in the 18th century. And that's the note, basically not for us, too narrow. Sometimes it just says this person, cannot write. I actually think the skip notes were among the strongest reviews that the book review, does. And I wish that we could publish them, but we would have way too many enemies and everyone would have to run and hide. So those are the ones that don't get reviewed. The ones that we do determine, or the preview editors determine, should be assigned. They then bring into a meeting with a number of senior editors, including me, and talk them through and say, this is what this book is. Here's why I think we should assign it. And they go through a list of people that they think would be good to review it. And then at that point, it really turns into a conversation. It opens up into, we might ask questions about the book. Are you really sure? This sounds very similar to this other book. Maybe we should review it together with that book. And then others in the room will bring up other names as potential reviewers, and eventually determine, okay, yes, we're going to review it. This is the length we want. This is the list of reviewers. Let's go in this order, and then they get assigned. Right.
Back when I was a preview editor of the book review, in the aughts primarily, we had these weekly meetings which were extremely intimidating. At the book review, Pamela's talking about preview editors, and what she means is, there's someone who's an expert on history and political science. There's someone who does fiction. There's someone who does in all these areas. They're experts. And when I was first starting there was a weekly meeting in which all the editors attended, and you had to bring in your stack of books that you're recommending for review that week and describe each one and explain what kind of review it should be, how long the review should be, and who might review it. And it was this time in which you just got savaged by your colleagues. I mean, gleefully, everyone, it was collegial, but it was also sort of vicious. And there'd be these conversations. You would suggest, I said, well, maybe I'll get X to review this novel. And a colleague would say, no, he's drunk now, lives in Sardinia, and he won't answer the phone. It was just this great inside knowledge about the literary world you would glean in these meetings. Let me ask you this, Pamela. What do you do if you call up someone to review a book and they say, I can't do it, I sort of know that person? I sort of know Salman Rushdie, or I sort of know Louise Erdrich. What happens then?
Well, I have to just quibble with the first part of your question, which is when I call someone up, which is like,
Well, when book review, when you email, or when someone on
yeah.
the book review emails them,
It's like a question out of 99,
right?
maybe. At the
And you
latest.
send them smoke signals. Um,
So we ask if the person has a conflict of interest, and that's something that we can do on our own. And I think we're one of the few outlets really that cares about this anymore. But remember, we are part of the New York Times. This is a journalistic endeavor. We have certain rules. We don't have, encourage log rolling or takedowns. We want to have someone who we think is going to come to a book with an open mind and review it on its own merits. And that means that they can't have, slept with the author. And believe me, there was one time where the person said, well, I really don't have a conflict because we haven't lived together in 7 years. And it's been, 4 years since we had sex. So like the people have different, different definitions of what constitutes a conflict, but ours are pretty strict, I would say. You cannot have blurbed the person and they cannot have blurbed you. You can't have the same agent or the same editor. In certain cases, when there's a small publisher, you can't share the same publisher with a behemoth like Penguin Random House. If the reviewer is, the author is over here in this sort of imprint and the reviewer is over here, then, that can be okay. But we try to make sure that nobody, that there's no established private or public connection between author and reviewer.
Do you know a good book review when it comes over the transom? Does it arrive sort of smoking in your hands and you go, this is a great review?
Oh, yeah.
How do you judge a really good review?
Oh my God. Well, it's funny, Dwight, and I think you'll agree with this. It's really easy to judge a bad book review. I feel like I'm an expert in saying like what a book review shouldn't be. It's harder to say what a good book review is. So I'm tempted to start with what a bad book review is, or what a bad book review does. So a book review is not a book report, and that's really hard for people to understand. They think that they need to tell you everything in the book and what the book is about, and you read it and you're like back in 10th grade, and it just doesn't feel good as a reader. A bad book review doesn't tell you what to think, what the reviewer thinks of the book. It doesn't issue judgment. So let me flip this to the positive. It's nicer. A good book review actively engages with the work. It reviews the book at hand. It doesn't say, I wish this book had been this book instead. It doesn't review the book that the reviewer wishes the author had written. It really judges the book on its own merits. And that doesn't mean you can't say like, it would have been better if the author had done X, Y, or Z. That's fair game. But you have to issue judgment. You need to say what the book does well, what it succeeds at. But I think also, as I said, to judge it on its own terms. So, certain books are not attempting to be high literature. It would be unfair to take a really good psychological, thriller and try to judge it by the same metric that you would judge a work of literary fiction. So I also think that there are many different kinds of good book reviews. There are certain things that book reviews need to do, right? They need to give you a sense of the writing. They need to quote from the work. I mean, you'd be surprised at how many book reviews you read where they don't ever give you a sense of the writing itself. They don't quote. So you do need to show the reader what this book is trying to do, who the voice is. And I also think that, this is, I think, I don't know if it's a dying art, but it's certainly an art under pressure of extinction. Criticism is an art form in and of itself. And I think that every book review should be something that you would want to read on its own, whether you want to read the book or not. And so when I was a preview editor a long time ago, which was the children's books editor, the way I assigned and edited, I thought, I want every single review on these kids' pages that to have something about it, force the person who's reading the book review stop, even if they hate kids, they don't have kids, they don't like children's books, they don't care about this book. I want to give them some reason to stop and read that book review anyway and enjoy it. Even if I
remember when I was assigning fiction reviews, I would often email the writer or call them up after I'd sent them the book and they'd read it. And I would say, what do you think of the book? And they would often say to me, Dwight, this is the worst thing I've ever read. It's horrible. And then the review would come in and it would sort of be this plot description and kind of saying pretty good, just generic review. And I would get the sense that you know, critics are sometimes, or people who don't write regularly, are sort of awed by the power of the New York Times. And often I would find, as an editor there, I was frustrated that critics wouldn't say what they really felt sometimes. Do you have that problem?
It still exists, yeah. I mean, you actually named two different problems. One is sort of like New York Times-itis that people get when you ask them to write for the book review. If they haven't written for the Times before for the book review, they assume this like voice that they think that we want, you know, which is not always necessarily their authentic voice. So there's just this kind of stiffness and this sort of like, I am being a responsible critic aspect to the writing. Generally speaking, that's not fun or interesting to read. But I actually find that I don't ask people before they hand it in what they think of the book, generally speaking. Occasionally, I'll need to know, like, are you going to be generally positive or negative about a book because I'm considering covers, for example, or a theme issue or doing something editorially that I kind of need to get a sense. But I do find that after I read a review, I'll often go back to the editor and say, I don't know what they thought of this book. You know, do they like it? and what's interesting, Dwight, is that sometimes they hate it and you can't tell. And then other times they actually love it, but it's like they're afraid to gush. I'm like, it's okay to say that you like something. It's okay. And one of the things that I love about your writing, Dwight, is that it's like a gut level criticism. Like, I know you sense how you feel. You respond very emotionally to the book, which I think is a great thing, as well as intellectual.
Yeah. So a lot of places now a lot of newspapers in America don't even have any book reviews anymore. And yet the the New York Times often reviews books twice. Can you explain to viewers, some of them will know, but a lot of them won't, why we review books twice sometimes?
You know, a lot of people won't know because a lot of people at the New York Times probably don't know, but there is a good reason. So we have two different ways of reviewing books at the Times, fundamentally. There are the daily critics, and that is Mr. Garner here, Jennifer Salai, and Parth Sehgal. They are full-time employees of the Times. They review books in what we still refer to as the daily pages, that is referring to the old-timey print edition of the book review, and they are of the institution. So they are reviewing, that is a New York Times review. They are paid by the Times to do this full time. And it enables us in many ways also to be able to do things that we can't do with the book review, which is largely written by freelance reviewers. And so the process is different as well. With the critics, with Dwight and Jen and Parl, we start with the critic and they determine which books they want to review. Now, it is certainly true that their editors will weigh in and say, no, could you please kind of really do this book, because we need the New York Times as an institution to weigh in. Our readers will want to know, for example, if John Bolton writes a book, if Bob Woodward writes a book, our readers are going to want to know. And the critics can't sort of, not that you would do this, say like, nah, I'm just not interested. I'm not in the mood. And I'll decide like, we don't want to. So if that ever should happen, we would say, well, one of you has to do it, and we would figure out who it would be. With the book review, it's not the critics who are determining which books to review. It's not the reviewers. We generally don't assign based on pitch emails. In other words, people can't email and say, hey, I'd like to do that. That's the job of the editors. It's the editors who determine what should be reviewed, and that's the hardest part of the job. And then it's up to them to determine who should review it, and that's the most interesting, fun, creative part of the job. That's making an interesting match. So where they appear in print, the Sunday book review, and where they appear and with the daily critics in the daily pages is one difference. The other difference is the approach. Critic determines the book, editor determines the book. And the other is that one is the voice of the institution, and the other one is we want to get the best voices out there in the larger world and bring them into the New York Times to offer different perspectives on books. And that's very useful to us. If, for example, you have a book that's come in and it is about 19th century industrialization in France, and maybe Dwight, Jen, and Parl didn't, get a PhD in that particular subject, we can find someone who did, or who wrote a novel set in that era who might be an interesting person to assess it, having done some research themselves. So we can find someone with a little bit of expertise or who might have a different perspective and review the book there. And as a consequence, you are often going to get the same book reviewed twice because you're doing two different things. And what we try to do is to determine really which of those books deserve two reviews and then try to be very strategic about how we cover each review. So if Dwight is going to review a novel, or let's say, I don't know, let's say Bob Woodward, and we decide then, okay, with the book review, we have a book critic on this book. Let's get someone who's worked in the government to review it for the book review. We might try to do something different there, so that we have kind of two different ways to approach the book for readers.
What's the best thing about being the editor of the New York Times Book Review?
The books. I mean, honestly, I joke, but you can see the shelves behind me. It is a really nice perk. I do miss it. I miss real books in the office, and that's not the real answer. I mean, the real answer is that it's a dream job for me. I think that if you had this job and it wasn't your dream come true, like you should just not. You're not allowed to have the job. I think that everyone who's had this job has just felt like this is what I've always wanted to do. And I have to say that for me to be at a newspaper, a news organization like the New York Times is an honor. It's a responsibility. It's a privilege. It's something I take really seriously, that we are not just covering books, but that we're doing so within a journalistic institution that has a really strong mission to cover without fear or favor. And I look at that and I apply that same approach to books. It's nice to be in the newsroom, but sort of not necessarily completely of the newsroom, and that we are reporting on works of art often. The other thing I think about books is that when you're covering books, you're really covering everything. You're covering the entire world, the real world, everything from economics to politics to science to math to history to biography to religion. I mean, every single subject. So we're just the lens, right? Books is just a lens, like the internet is a lens through which to see everything. We get to do all of that. And then we get to do all of the fiction, every single form of fiction, from fantasy to science fiction to historical fiction to literary fiction to poetry. So we get to do the entire world as it exists, and then the entire world that doesn't really exist. I mean, what more?
You mentioned the newsroom. Are you going crazy being at home? Or are you just sort of loving it?
I don't hate it. I miss the newsroom. I miss colleagues. I miss being surrounded by books. I think that you really lose something when they're all reduced to a line in a spreadsheet to PDFs, and that, there's a reason why I, as a reader, prefer to read physical books. There's something about, that object, but also as an editor, and what is editing but curation in many ways? So you're looking at a landscape, and for me at work, that's shelves of books, that's galleys piled up, that's making connections visually when you see things together. And also, a lot of what we do, we're lucky to be in New York. We're in the center of publishing. We have lunches with publishers, with editors, with authors. You're sort of constantly talking to other literary journalists out in the field, talking about what's good, what looks interesting, fun scandals or serious issues that the industry is contending with, and you kind of lose that when you're not in the office. The other thing, and I think anyone who has an office job can relate to this, is that everything when you're online is intentional. Like, you don't pass someone in the hallway and say like, hey, you don't really see someone across the Zoom room and say like, you can't make eye contact and exchange information. And one of the great things about being a kind of publication within a much larger publication is that you're constantly intersecting with people who cover really different things and finding out, what's going on in their world. And sometimes that affects what you're doing. So it gives you a kind of broader landscape, to bump into someone who's working on an investigation and hearing about that, or being in a meeting with people who are on the science desk and finding out what they're discussing and reporting on. So I think you lose a lot.
So you're running a staff beneath you. Talk to me a bit about how you're fitting in now with the daily report of the New York Times. How many meetings are you in terms of keeping track and others talking to you about what you're doing? How in touch are you right now with the newsroom and other people there? Do you spend a lot of time in meetings about that?
Well, I could talk about today, just to give an example of, and no day is typical, but so today is the day that I record the podcast. So I woke up and I worked for an hour and a half before entering my closet to record my podcast, and I interviewed 2 people on the podcast. Then I had a conversation that we have every week called What We're Reading, and sometimes it's with the critics and sometimes it's with editors of the book review. And I have to say that during quarantine, I like hang on to that conversation for dear life, because I have great colleagues. We have a really great staff at the book review, and it's like we get to talk to one another. So those conversations, they're edited a bit for the podcast because they can go on for like 30 minutes. We really do enjoy talking to one another, not just about books. So I had that conversation. I interviewed our publishing reporter, and then at 12 o'clock, we had a newsroom-wide meeting with leadership of the New York Times for an hour. I did an hour of work, and then I had a meeting with Dean to talk about something, Dean Baquet, who's our executive editor. At 3 o'clock, we had our department meeting. At 4 o'clock, I went to what used to be called a page 1 meeting. In the age of the internet, that's a little bit antiquated. It's now called the afternoon news meeting. And any of you who are interested in what that looked like at least 10 years ago, which of course it doesn't look like it now, but there's a great documentary called Page 1 that's basically about that meeting. And what happens at that meeting is that sort of a head or representative from every single desk at the Times gets together with the masthead of the New York Times, which is the leadership, the executive editor, the assistant and associate masthead editors of the Times, as well as a number of people around the Times who work on things like video and social media and audience and audio. And you get together in what was a room and it's now a Zoom or a Google Hangout in our case. And each desk takes turns to present the stories that they have ready or will have ready to go online that evening and the following morning for the afternoon meeting. And at the end of the meeting, everyone kind of leaves the room and there's a determination made, okay, this is what we're going to put up on the homepage. This is where this is going to go. And this is, these are the stories that we've decided are the most important, and coming up with that mix so that our online readers kind of, it determines what our online readers will see, generally speaking, on the homepage for that evening and the following morning.
Right. I've been in 1 or 2 page 1 meetings. I'm wondering what it's like for you now, seeing all the elite editors of the New York Times, all of them in their homes on Zoom. Is it wild to sort of see everyone? Is everyone sort of very casual and just come back from jogging? Or is it kind of a formal experience? What are these meetings like now under COVID?
Well, Dean Baquet wore a hoodie. He loves hoodies. He wore a New York Times hoodie today. I have to say, we love spying on people's bookshelves, we at the book review especially. And there are some editors and reporters who give like a really good bookshelf game going on. It's interesting. We all have our thing. And I think, everyone sees versions of their colleagues that they've never seen before. Obviously, there are lots of children coming in and out of screens, depending on, the sort of domestic situation of the person. I have 3 children, so they will wander in and out. My husband's also working at home. I have 3 cats. I have 1 cat who'll climb on my shoulder and then settle in there like a kind of like a first stole. He did that in a meeting with Simon and Schuster, shortly into quarantine, and he was just there. So you definitely get a more complete picture of people's lives.
I love it. Speaking of more complete picture, tell viewers where you are right now. You're at home. You live where?
I live outside of the city, and I'm actually in my bedroom. We have a home office that doesn't have a lot of books in it, and I'm actually a big believer in books in every room of the house, and I mean that truly. In bathrooms, I have them in the kitchen, they're in the dining room, they're everywhere, and I'm a little bit strategic about what books are where. This is my bedroom. These are my bedroom bookshelves. These are the books that I want in my room with me.
Yeah. Do you read? I mean, do you read in bed, or do you? Because I find it hard to read in bed. I usually look at my phone in bed. I'm embarrassed to say.
You look at your phone in bed?
Well, I normally when I go to bed, I'm going to bed. I read all day, and when I go to bed, I'm sort of done.
Oh, see, that's interesting. I I can't read during the day. I feel like I'm playing if I read during the day because I love it so much. And even though I know that it's work for me, given my job, I really can't read during the day. It just feels like cheating because reading has always been my favorite pastime. Reading is my pleasure. And if I do it during the day, I'm not really working. I understand that sounds insane, but there you have it. So I never read a book during the day. I will read after work. And I mean, I will read around books, you know, when I'm preparing for the podcast and that kind of thing, but to sit down and actually read, I couldn't do it. I'd also probably fall asleep, and that I'm afraid happens at night too, if I go into bed to read. So I generally, you know, one of the nice things about having older children is they all read too. So we parallel read, you know, the way that little kids will parallel play. I will, and I'm very happy not to have to read to my children anymore, although on occasion I still do. Generally speaking, I will plant myself in one of their rooms after dinner and I will read in there until bedtime. And then I do have to read in bed in order to fall asleep, but it's rare for me to last for more than 10 pages before that happens.
How often does it happen, Pamela, that you have a sort of stop the presses moment? You have a issue kind of ready maybe to go to bed and something comes in and you're just like, all right, we're going to rip things up. Does that happen very often at the book review?
It doesn't happen often, but it happened recently, actually. We had a novel that was going to be on the cover of one of our October issues, and really at the last minute for us, I substituted it for something else because we got in a review of two books that I thought, you know, I should say, like, I'm sure they're really good books, but I didn't think of them as books for the cover. So one of them was by my counterpart, or your counterpart, one of our in-between counterpart, the nonfiction book critic at the Washington Post, Carlos Losada, called What We Were Thinking, about reading 150 books about the Trump era. And the other book was also by two Washington Post reporters, and it was a look into all of the investigations of Trump and his administration. And so these were not obvious picks for the cover. I think, you know, I'm sort of constantly calibrating with the book review. We are part of a newspaper, but we're also about books. Sometimes you don't want to read something totally on the news. Sometimes the book review is like a nice, you know, departure from the news cycle for our readers, I think. So I don't want to have every cover, you know, be about our current moment. We can't have everything be pandemic and election. So I wasn't going to put it on the cover. But the review came in and it was by Joe Klein, the author of Primary Colors, and it was just a perfect review. It was like a great, fun, wasn't it great? It was such a good piece of writing. And I thought, it doesn't matter that these books, you know, that it doesn't matter. This is a brilliant piece of book criticism. This is a great essay. It's a fun, informative, you know, invigorating thing to read. And when would you want to put it on? When else but, you know, during this moment right before the election? What was kind of amazing about it too is that we, you know, I worked together with our art director on art, and we ended up having the cover shows a TV screen, kind of a meltdown happening on it. And it so happened that the review went online the night after the first presidential debate, which I think no matter what candidate you favor, I think most people felt like was not the best instance of sort of presidential, you know, candidate discourse.
Right.
So it felt like, oh my God, it's actually timely.
I'm glad you mentioned the art department at the book review, because people don't talk about this very often, I found, but the book review is an important forum for graphic art in America. As a matter of fact, when I arrived at the book review, the head of the art department, the art director, was a guy named Stephen Heller, and who's one of the gurus of design in America. He's written about 400 books, and he was replaced by Nicholas Bleckman, who left to become the design editor of the New Yorker magazine. And talk to us now about the art director and how you work with him.
So we have a great art director, Matt Dorfman. What's interesting about Matt and Nicholas and Stephen Heller is they were all art directors of the op-ed page at the New York Times, which is really the other great forum for incredible illustration at the Times. And what's amazing about them is that they have to do it, generally speaking, in black and white, and the artists have to turn it around, you know, often by the end of the day when you get something newsy in. So for the art director there, it's kind of like a war zone that you're working in. To come to the book review is like an incredible, leisurely, wonderful opportunity, because we know the news, you know, essentially 6 months ahead of time. And so we can work together on what an illustration is going to be, you know, for weeks. And the art director has the opportunity to work in color and to go back and forth. And, you know, earlier on, you asked me about what I love about being at the book review. And I have to say that working out the cover art with the art director is one of the highlights of my week, each week, figuring out who's going to be the artist. Sometimes we go with photography. And so in that can also be interesting. We either use, you know, archival photography, or sometimes we do a photo shoot. But I think the idea of illustrating a book review is a really, really interesting challenge, because you are in part illustrating the book review, and in part you're illustrating the book, and you're trying to convey an idea on the cover. And there's so many different directions you can go in. Matt Dorfman is incredibly talented. He's also a book cover designer. He's an illustrator in his own right. He's illustrated everything from the very first time that the New York Times did an investigation of Donald Trump's taxes. There was an incredible kind of photo collage on the front page on A1 of the New York Times, and Matt Dorfman was the art director who designed that. So he does his own illustration work in the Times and elsewhere, as well as book covers, and designs the book review.
Are we going to be reading Donald Trump books for the rest of our lives?
I don't think so. I don't, you know, I'm no guru. I don't know how this election will turn out. I do think, though, that when we talk about Donald Trump, we're not really talking about an individual, but I think we're talking about our country and issues that his candidacy and his presidency have either surfaced or resurfaced or highlighted the importance of, that touch on all different things going on in the country, everything, you know, from race to class to gender to religion, free speech, I mean, you know, everything. So I think that there are going to be books for a while to come that sort of look at this time and try to understand it better. And again, I'm going to go back to your question about what do I love about this job. I mean, the great thing about books is that it gives you a moment to step back and look at something in a broader and deeper context than you can in the daily paper, where you're just kind of trying to keep on top of the news. I mean, we do analysis at the New York Times, but you don't have that luxury of sitting back and working for 6 months or 10 years on a subject and getting that long view, getting that perspective. And I think that the book review is the place where we're working on the coverage that really goes deeply into questions like, what does this presidency mean? Why did it happen? What will its legacy be? I don't know that anywhere is going to do that better than books. I can't imagine.
Yep. Did you read the book review when you were younger? Younger, defined however you'd like to, A. And B, do you remember first liking a critic in any genre and who that person might have been? Like liking critical writing?
Oh, you know, it's funny. I think the first critic that I really noticed, and he's still at the Times and he writes for us. So, you know, I was really excited to meet him. It's A.O. Scott, Tony Scott. I read his movie reviews mostly. He was a book critic before he was a movie reviewer. And to my mind, he's still really a book critic. But I read his movie reviews, and the thing that I loved about his movie reviews is just how fun they were. It didn't matter what he was reviewing. I mean, Anthony Lane at the New Yorker is similar. To me, a great reviewer is, you don't care what they're reviewing. You just want to read their writing. And that's the way I feel about both of them. I feel like I just want to read it for the experience of the criticism itself. But I wasn't one of those kids who, you know, grew up sort of going through volumes of Pauline Kael or reading, you know, Edmund Wilson. I wasn't exposed to criticism at a young age. I think what I did was, I was a New York Times, we were a New York Times family. So I always had the daily paper delivered, and I always subscribed to the New York Times, and I always read the reviews. And I think that, like many people, I didn't pay attention to the bylines, but I loved the form.
It's funny, you mentioned Anthony Lane. I think I turn to Anthony Lane first in every issue of The New Yorker that I get. It's just because he's reliably, not just smart, but he's reliably funny. And it occurs to you after a while that having a sharp wit is really important in a critic, I think.
Oh my God.
And so that's why I love to read him.
The thing that I remember that Tony Scott did was he was reviewing a documentary about stand-up comedy. And I ended up seeing that documentary, but it wasn't necessarily top of my list. I don't particularly enjoy stand-up comedy, so there's no reason for me to read it. But when he, in the lead of his review, he talked about how when he worked at a different paper in his early years, his editor sort of called him into his office and, to have a talking to, he was getting reprimanded. And the reprimand was, Tony, just every single one of your pieces have to begin with, have a lead that begins with Seinfeld. And Tony Scott had like a parenthetical that said, I think, no, I said shamefacedly. And I just loved that so much. That's the way.
Okay, let's turn my first question around. One of my first questions. What's the worst thing about being the editor of the New York Times Book Review?
Well, the worst thing is that, at any given moment, you're making 90%, maybe 99% of the writers in the country miserable. Because either you're not reviewing their books, and that's very likely because we review about 1% of the books published in any given year, or you've assigned the book to the wrong reviewer, or the reviewer you assigned it to maybe was the right reviewer but didn't like the book, so it was the wrong review. And everyone holds you, the editor, responsible. It's very much a buck stops here kind of job. So it doesn't matter. I don't review for the New York Times Book Review. Previous editors have done that. I made a deliberate decision never to review as long as I'm editor for our pages. I feel like that's not my job. But it doesn't matter that I'm not writing those reviews. I'm responsible if they're negative. So, and I remember before I started this job, back when Chip McGrath, who's now 2 editors ago, was retiring, there was an article in the New York Observer by Rachel Donadio, who actually went on to work at the Book Review, and later was the Rome bureau chief at the Times, and then she's now at the Atlantic. But she wrote this news story, and in the story it said something like, the Book Review is not a job for people who, depend on approval from others. And that's really true. So you do become a little bit hardened. I think that having written books is a real advantage in this job. I mean, it's a disadvantage emotionally because you know how awful it is to work really hard in a book and not get the glowing review and praise and bestseller status that you feel that if you don't deserve, certainly you would love to have. But I also think it's good because it gives you a sense of what's at stake, and it gives you a real respect for other writers, and not just writers, editors and publishers, all the work that goes into the putting together of a book. It's kind of like there are journalism professors who've never really practiced journalism, and all they do is criticize journalists. And you think, you know what, maybe you ought to come down to a newsroom and try it out for a moment. So I do feel like that is an advantage, having been an author.
I know that you're a somewhat social person when you're in New York. I know, and it's important. It's a social job. I mean, you have to go to some of these lunches to meet some of the writers and learn about the books, and some of them are fun as well, and the parties are. Do you ever get blowback from people who've been reviewed negatively, or their editors, or their publicists, and it's they're just upset with you, and maybe won't write for you next time? And in what ways do you feel that from writers who feel they've been snubbed by the book review?
Oh, I mean, I'm not going to go into like all the horrible scenes at parties and uncomfortable conversations, but yeah, I mean, look, some people have different, responses to a negative review. I remember someone was telling me that our former colleague, the late David Carr, was once consoling a friend of mine about a bad review. And she said, well, how do you handle a bad review? And he said, person didn't like it. He just tossed it off like it didn't matter, and then there are instances where, someone is so angry I'm not going to name names, but, there's one very famous writer who is, makes a point of telling me, I think the last time I was at a big gala that was honoring Toni Morrison, and he said, you New York Times Book Review, you never give me a good review.
I was there that night. I remember that.
Okay,
Yeah.
so we know who we're talking about. Sorry, folks. I'm not going to badmouth anyone. But what's incredible is that really and truly, that is not our goal. That's never our goal. Like, why would we do that? We don't do setups. They like to do that in the UK. And I think that, there's probably a lot of fun to it. But what we do as journalists at the New York Times is we are really trying to give readers an honest assessment, an open assessment. Doesn't mean that they're all going to be positive. And I think there's a role for negative reviews. But if we did a setup, that doesn't help readers out at all, because then they just say, well, of course, so-and-so hated that book, that they're political opposites or whatever it might be. So we don't try to do that. We would never try to do that. It just so happens that sometimes people get very negative reviews and take it out on me.
I mean, that's a good issue you brought up, the opposite political spectrum thing, because I remember, you're assigning, let's say, a new book of political essays, and the person is a conservative. You don't always want to go to conservative with a conservative book, or you don't always go to a liberal with a liberal book, right? And I know there's been some famous matchups. I remember, this is way back in the history hopper, but when Henrik Hertzberg, his book of essays came out, the book review when I was there gave it to a right-wing, a person on the right, and he really ripped it apart. And Hertzberg was, a little upset we give it to someone on the right. And yet, those kind of reviews, you have to sort of give both sides a chance to talk to each other. How does that work out with your assigning?
Well, I think it's gotten harder. It's gotten harder in the last 10 years because as our country has become more polarized and people really, I think, have sort of, I don't know, I'll just say more polarized. I think everyone knows what I mean. It's hard to find a middle ground. And I think that you really don't want liberal on liberal, conservative on conservative, and you don't want the opposite either. What you want is someone who's open-minded. What you want is someone who says, you know what, putting aside my political agenda, putting aside my own ideology, I can honestly assess this work. And I think that you can write a positive review of a book without endorsing its message. Because again, it goes back to what I was talking about, reviewing a book on its own terms, right? If somebody says, this is what I believe, and they write the book and they go out and they prove it and their argument is persuasive, even if you don't agree with it, you can say, you know what, this person did what they set out to do and they did it well and it's a well-written book. I don't think that deserves a negative review just because you don't agree. So it's harder to find those in-between reviewers, after Christopher Hitchens, who, was definitely an ideological person, but he was also a unpredictable person. After he died, we would find ourselves saying, like, where's Hitchens now? Because one thing about Hitchens is that you didn't know what he would think. And so when we make assignments, I find some of the most exciting assignments to make are when you're like, I don't know what they'll say. That's my favorite thing to say when we're making an assignment, because you shouldn't know what the person's going to say. And there are some people who I think are reliably open-minded, but there are fewer and fewer of them.
With most publications, if a piece comes in that the editors are disappointed with, it just doesn't run. The book review doesn't have that option a lot of times, right?
Yeah.
Can you explain what that is?
If we kill a review, then we're killing the review of that book. You can't reassign a book after you kill the review. Why not? Because that would, I think, undermine our journalistic integrity. That would open up people to say, oh, they didn't like what so-and-so said. They got a negative review. They really wanted that book to get a positive review. So then they went to this other person so that they could get a rave. We deal with that. One of the tricky things we deal with, which involves negative reviews, politics, and unfriendliness at parties and the like, is we review our own colleagues' work at the New York Times Book Review. So you could say, let's say, if that ever happened where we assigned a book by one of our colleagues and then reassigned it, they would say, oh, somebody came in and said, you can't give a negative review to, this opinion columnist or that star reporter. So we don't do that. So we do try to get the review to work because we think it's unfair to the author to lose the opportunity to have their work honestly assessed and to get that critical attention, even if it's a negative review. And look, sometimes the reviews that you need or have to kill can be positive reviews. the only time, well, there are very rare occasions in the years that I've been at the book review in which we've killed reviews. And I would say the most common one, and again, I think we're talking like I can count them on, two hands, but the most common one is conflict of interest, that you find out afterwards, you know what, there was a conflict there, that the person was not open about. And that's a very unfortunate situation, again, because the author is the one who loses, which is why we really try hard to make that determination beforehand.
Right. I know you have a team of editors, but in terms of your own editing, what kind of editor do you think you are? Are you a heavy-handed editor? Or are you a hands-off editor, do you think, in your own estimation?
It's funny. I think it depends on who I'm editing. Sometimes when I was the children's books editor, I was often editing people who were not professional critics. Often they were writing their first review, and I was often trying to really broaden who we had writing about children's books. I wanted people who had never reviewed a children's book review to write one. So that meant you had to do a lot of heavy editing. And in those instances, and knowing that it wasn't their expertise, and that in many cases they were grateful to have the editing, I was a very heavy-handed editor, kind of handing back, this is, do it like this, which is not a very nice way to be edited for many people, but for people where it's not their job, often they're just grateful, like, okay, you made it better. With people who are real writers and critics, I try to be more hands-off and to suggest more. And then I edit myself in my own writing, and I'm brutal. So I can be extremely harsh and mean in a way that, like, if anyone else did that to me, I would shrivel up and crawl away.
Yeah. So let me ask a podcast question. I remember when Sam Tannenhouse, your predecessor, hosted the podcast, he was proud of the fact he did no preparation. He was at the Charlie Rose School. If you remember Charlie Rose on his interviews, he would often clearly not read the book. An author would come on and Charlie would say, "Your book, why now?" These really obvious questions. And how much work do you do to prep for the podcast?
Well, so a couple of things. One is that most radio interviews and television interviewers, they have a team that they work with, people who read through the books, to choose the books, prepare the questions, do the research. But we don't have that at the Book Review Podcast. It's me. So I don't go as far as Sam in not preparing. I was shocked when he said he didn't prepare at all, and he could pull it off. And Sam is incredibly talented, and one of his many talents is that he has a formidable memory. So, he could be interviewing someone and pull out something about, the Illinois senatorial race in 1960, and I don't have that database. I have a very faulty memory. So he was able to add a lot in his interviews that he didn't require prep work. I don't prepare as much as you might think, in that I don't read all the books. And I think that that's an advantage. I read around the books and I read the reviews, and sometimes I read the books, but I don't always read the books because, and here's where Sam's advice was very helpful. He said, you're not there to show off what you know. You're there as the stand-in for the listener. And they, in most cases, 99% of the cases, have not read the book either. And so you want to ask the questions that the listener who's curious would want to ask. And so I find that actually to be a really good position in, and that helps determine the choices of books and authors that I want to talk about, because I try to go with things that I'm genuinely curious about. I also want to go with things that hopefully my listeners will be interested in. But I feel like if I really want to know the answer, because I don't know the answer, then your listener feels that, your listener gets that. That's a kind of curiosity and sort of hunger that I think is contagious. There have been instances where I've read a book, and after I've read it, I thought, oh my God, I got to talk to this author about it. I need to get them on the podcast. And I think that while I really enjoyed those particular conversations, and one I'll say off the bat was Ted Chiang's short story collection, Exhalation. I had him on the podcast after I read the book, and it was well after the book had come out. I don't know that it was necessarily better for listeners, because I was asking the questions that I was really curious about, having read all the stories. And I think that maybe listeners, it may have been too in the weeds for them. I don't know. It's up to listeners to let me know.
Is it hard to, I found it hard when I was doing the podcast at times to often interview fiction writers rather than nonfiction writers. With a nonfiction book, you've got a topic as well. You can ask questions of the writer and their process, but you also have this topic to discuss. With fiction, sometimes, I mean, frankly, I'm among those readers who doesn't care a lot about plot. I mean, I certainly care enough, but what I don't really want to hear is someone describe how in this novel the sisters drive across the country and meet their brother. That matters to me, but in the end, that's not what's important about the novel. What's important is the life that the writer brings to it, and it's often hard to get to that life when you're interviewing a fiction writer. And I'm wondering if you have any advice or any thinking about interviewing a fiction writer versus a nonfiction writer.
Well, I think you're right. I think it can be hard. And I think, there are people who like to talk about their novels, and there are others really, who don't. They don't want to. It's on the page, and they either don't want to or don't enjoy or don't feel comfortable talking about their work. Fiction writers, I think, more so than nonfiction writers, because they sort of feel like, I've told you the story, here it is. And so, one of the things that helps and that I don't have as much is that when you are in New York in the office, publishers will have lunches for authors, in which you get to hear them talk about their work. And so I go to every one of those lunches that I possibly can, and I go frequently to lectures and panels to hear authors talking about their work, to get a sense of like who's able to discuss their work, who can have an interesting conversation, who would I want to talk to, and that really helps. So that kind of being out and about in the world is a little bit lost. Obviously, I'm in Zooms like this, and I hear about things that way, but you don't get to have those kind of side personal conversations too that might give you some fodder to go on when having a podcast interview about fiction. Another thing that we can do on the book review and do that I think is different from a lot of other review podcasts is that we often will have the critic in, and I find that it's really interesting to talk to a critic about fiction, especially if they've read a lot of the author's work or they can put it into context. So a couple of recent examples on the podcast, I had Daniel Mendelsohn to come in, talk about David Mitchell's new novel, but he talked about all of his work. Or I had Dana Tortorici, who's a co-editor of a literary journal called N+1. She came into my closet on my headset. She was on the podcast recently to talk about the work of Elena Ferrante. And that to me gives another layer that I think is an advantage of our podcast, as opposed to when you only talk to novelists. I also think, novelists, I'm interested in the writing process in a way that I think probably Charlie Rose is maybe not as well, he's obviously no longer, but a lot of interviewers are focusing on the content, and I'm interested, because it's a book review podcast, talking a little bit about the process and the kind of how things get put together. And I think listeners are really interested in that. So if nothing else, you can sort of fall back on like how did you make this thing and how do you work? I think people are really interested in like the daily lives of writers, like where do you sit? What do you wear? Like how long can you write for? Do you know the ending of your book before you start? And so those are always, interesting conversations.
How do you fight through? A lot of writers have been on their sort of road warriors by now with some of their books, and they've done a million interviews. How do you fight through the rote answers and get to something that feels remotely real?
Oh, I mean, mostly I do it by not overly preparing and by having a real conversation and trying to think, sometimes you'll be at like a dinner party and you think every single person, even the most boring looking person, has something interesting about them. There's some interesting story. They have strengths and there's something, and it's up to you, the interviewer, to find out what that is. And I think, being a journalist foremost and being a reporter and having interviewed people, you think that's your job. So you kind of, you have to be interested in people and be genuinely asking these questions and trying to determine what is it. And so I think that if you overly prepare and you have a list of questions that you're kind of running through, you're going to get someone who's in that mode running through their rote list of answers. And so sometimes you just ask them a question, like you'll probably throw me off right now and ask me some crazy question, throw me off my rote game here.
All right, give us a podcast and a TV show. Give us a podcast you love and a TV show we should all watch. Or movie.
Okay, so I don't watch a huge amount of TV. I feel ashamed of that. That's my retirement plan, is to sit around and watch a lot of TV. But I'm going to recommend something that I recommend to one of our colleagues and to your editor, John Williams, and he finally listened to me like 2 years after I made the recommendations. Here's TV, is Borgen, which is a really brilliant Danish television show. The acting is brilliant. It's about the female Danish prime minister, and it's about the media, it's about the politics, it's about government, and it's essentially about, I mean, it's essentially about all the things that or many of the things that I care about, but the perspective is thrown off center, because even though, not just that it's in Europe, but it's in Denmark. And so what Denmark cares about is like Greenland, which is completely off the radar for most of us. And it's interesting to see things from this perspective of this country that's not even what we here consider to be one of the most important, whatever that means, European countries. But in that show, Denmark is the center of the world. So that makes it all sound really serious, but it's all about the, you know, the marriages and the love affairs and the parenting and a lot of, did you see it?
I haven't. My wife is watching it right now, but I'm not with her on it.
Okay, then you have work to do. The podcast that I just discovered recently that I loved, and it's probably not surprising that I love interview podcasts, but I recently discovered this the podcast. I'm going to forget the actor's name. It's so-and-so does a podcast. Now,
Not David Tennant or Louis Theroux.
David Tennant.
David Tennant.
David Tennant, who is also in a great TV show called Broadchurch. And he does a podcast. And first of all, if you know David Tennant, he's got a great Scottish accent. So whatever he's talking about, it doesn't matter. It's in a wonderful accent. You can just listen to him. But he also happens to interview people whom I love and talking about the arts in a way that kind of makes you feel like, oh, this whole pandemic, it's just, you know, melts away. Listening to him interview James Corden, who is someone I absolutely adore, Ian McKellen, another person I'm a huge fan of, Olivia Colman, his co-star in Broadchurch, Judi Dench. So I've just kind of loved diving into those podcasts.
Are you an audiobook person?
Not hugely, no. I don't have a time or a place for it, to be honest. I love them, but it doesn't fit in.
Okay. Give us one recommendation. How about, you're not a total foodie, are you? Do you have a cookbook recommendation? Do you have a cookbook you found?
Oh my God, I love food. Anything by Ottolenghi. Ottolenghi has a new cookbook coming out, Flavor, but I love Ottolenghi. They're impossible, you know, they have like 10,000 ingredients, and one of them is always like, I don't know, cardamom seeds or just something you just don't have, or tamarind leaves. But Ottolenghi Simple is his sort of pared down one. My kids joke, I once made a very simple roasted broccoli recipe from Ottolenghi that took me like, I don't know, 4 hours, you know, but when it was finally done, and it was a very simple thing, it was just all about the process. After they said like, that was the best broccoli ever, can you like keep making that? No.
Well, listen, we've gone about 25 or 30 minutes now over our allotted time. Do our hosts want to jump back in and there might have been some questions, as I recall.
Yes, I do. I have actually. I just want to congratulate both of you on having this wonderful interview, because we've had more interactions with our audience than ever before. I have probably close to 35 questions that have come in over. So obviously we are not going to get to address all of those. So I will do my best to edit and pull from you, Pamela, and just pick out some really good questions for you. So one of our attendees would love to know, just to keep on rolling with Dwight's recommendations, one book that has surprised you this year that you would recommend to any reader, any type of reader.
Surprised me. Well, you know, I read a lot of old books. I'm going to talk about an old book and a new book that I read this year. So one old book, but it wasn't old to me, was, and I mean, it's not old, sorry. One old book that was new to me because it came in on the shelves in a brand new, really lovely edition that's like right behind me on the shelves. There was Thomas Hardy's The Mayor of Casterbridge. And I love Thomas Hardy because they're incredibly tragic, dark and sad tales that, you know, it has nothing to do with like all of the troubles of the world now. So you can sink into it and go through all of those emotions. And yet not feel like it's causing any trouble in your own world. And The Mayor of Casterbridge 2 has probably the most boring title, you know, that you could possibly imagine. And yet it's a total page turner. So I highly recommend it. I just bought The Return of the Native, another Thomas Hardy that I've never read, at an independent bookstore a couple weeks ago. That's I know, on the top of my pile over there. Another book that I also read recently that I was surprised to find myself reading and I really appreciated was a bestseller. I think it came out last year, called The Only Plane in the Sky, which is about 9/11. And I picked it up on the 19th anniversary, as it is now, or is it 18th? 19th anniversary of 9/11. And I love oral histories. One of the things that I think was most interesting to me about this book is that I experienced 9/11 in New York, where, you know, we saw New York as the center, and you kind of heard about the Pentagon and you read about, you know, where George W. Bush was when this happened and that he was flying around, and then you knew about Flight 93. But what this book does is in a kind of moment by moment way, runs you through those 24 hours in all of those locations. So you get a real sense of how that all played out. And I think that oral histories are underappreciated or underestimated. It's an incredible act of editing to, you know, take everyone's history of what they said, plus do all of, you know, a bunch of interviews of your own, and to, you know, sort of boil that down to a coherent narrative, I think is a real feat. And he did it well, and told things that I hadn't known. And I'm just going to tell one tiny story that really blew me away. And I think I talked about it in the podcast. It was a story from someone who was relatively minor in it. It was a person who checked in one of the flights out of Boston. He was the person who, you know, put the names, let the two of the terrorists in and put their names on the manifest, and, you know, let them get on the plane. And, you know, he said the next day he came into work and no one would talk to him. And he just felt this tremendous amount of guilt. And so that was a really powerful book. It's, you know, it's 19 years later, and I don't know, it just felt to me an interesting time to look back on that moment, because that was also a moment in which a national tragedy brought people together. And I don't know that we necessarily are experiencing that during what I think is a current tragic moment with the pandemic. Okay, I'm going to bring it up a little bit. I'm going to talk about a new book this year that I also really loved. It, you know, it's interesting. You probably can tell that I'm a kind of dark reader. I really like a book that makes me cry, maybe even more than a book that makes me laugh. So the other book I'm going to say actually makes you laugh and cry. It's Homeland Elegies by Ayad Akhtar. It came out last month, and it's a novel, although it is a highly autobiographical novel. It's a lightly fictionalized novel. I think there are a lot of interesting questions you can ask about the form and to what extent is it a novel or not. I do believe it is a novel. And it's told by Akhtar, who is known primarily as a playwright. He wrote a Pulitzer Prize winning play called Disgraced, and he is a Pakistani American writer who really writes about the experience of being a Pakistani American in this, you know, not just post 9/11, but what's interesting is that 9/11 was just kind of one major event, transformative event in the experience of being a Pakistani American. There was the, you know, Afghanistan invasion before that. That was also sort of a fundamental turning point in that experience. And I'm making this sound very serious and boring. There's a lot of sex in this book. It's really funny. He's a great writer. And he starts off with a story that you don't know whether it's true or not, but his father was a doctor and he was Donald Trump's doctor. And so he tells you some stories about his father, who becomes a big supporter of Donald Trump and his experience in treating Donald Trump in the 90s.
Awesome, wonderful. Well, so I have a question it's a twofer for both of you. So you talk about the editor and your role. You're basically this matchmaker between the critics and the books. So and you touched on this briefly, but I would love to know one completely unexpected pairing that you yourself knew going into it, or maybe you didn't know going into it, was going to turn out as great as it did. And then Dwight, for you as the critic, from your stance, what was one that stands out in your repertoire that felt really unexpected to receive, but you were glad you did it in the end?
So repeat the question. A book that I didn't.
That you reviewed that you didn't expect to have that book assigned to you. that it felt like an odd pairing maybe from the beginning?
Well, I mean, these days, I'm a daily critic for the Times. My reviews appear every Tuesday in the paper, and I get to pick what I review now, which sounds great, and it is great. But I will say that there's something to be said as a writer for having someone pull you out of your comfort zone and assign something really different to you. And I'm trying to think, back when I was a critic, before I sort of picked on my own books, if I had any experiences in that way, I can't really think of any. But I'll tell you, when I first became one of the daily critics was back about 12 years ago. And the lead critic then was Michiko Kakutani, and Janet Maslin was also a critic, and I was a critic. And there was a slot open for me that was kind of supposed to be mostly nonfiction, mostly kind of heavy lifting nonfiction biographies and serious works of history, that kind of thing. And as a critic, I floundered for about a year, I think, until I realized that as a critic, you have to sort of follow your own impulses and your own tastes and review the books you want to review, or else you're not going to really connect with readers. And I think if I do connect with readers, that it only began in the year where I decided, okay, enough with the history of medicine and the Civil War. Nothing wrong with that topic, by the way, but not really my kind of topic. And when I started reviewing poetry, when I started reviewing, quirkier maybe books about music, photography, then I sort of found my voice as a critic. And it is important to sort of go with your gut and with your instincts pretty often.
I want to answer by not answering the question that you asked me, but sort of side swiping it a little bit to say two things. One is, some of the things I read that I never thought I would read, I read only because of Dwight's review. His enthusiasm is so infectious that I find myself reading something that I really just would never have picked up otherwise. And the most recent example of that was a book by Tommy Tomlinson, who was a former columnist for a North Carolina newspaper called The Elephant in the Room. And he talks about what it's like to be a 460-pound man in America and how he got that way and his efforts to lose weight. And Tomlinson is someone I'd never read before, and he writes mostly about music and sports, neither of which are my thing, to put it mildly. But Dwight enthused about this book, and so I read it. So to me, like, Dwight is my unexpected match as a reader. Like, if Dwight loves a book in a certain way, then I will read it.
Well, I grew up as a pretty chubby kid. I was in Weight Watchers a lot when I was young, and I still fight. Maybe like a lot of people, I really fight my weight. And you read a book like Tommy Tomlinson's, and first of all, it's somewhat rare that a man writes that book. It's not really rare, but more rare than reading books like that from women. And it's just it's funny, the strange topics that can appeal to you. It's not always the obvious ones. I mean, that book sort of came out of nowhere. And Tommy Tomlinson has one of these heartland voices. I used to love growing up as a reader of these columnists who were sort of heartland columnists, whether it was Mike Royko or Ellen Goodman writing for the Boston Globe. And he has that kind of heartland voice. And I fear with newspapers dying that we're losing those kind of heartland columnists. But has that voice for me that I really love.
The other thing I was going to say is that, so unlike Dwight, I've never been a daily critic for the Times, but I did used to review quite a bit for the book review. I think I mentioned that Dwight assigned me a number of those reviews. And I actually loved getting a book that I never would have picked up and didn't think I was necessarily suited for. Couldn't really understand why they thought I was the one to review it. Those were my favorite assignments, and almost all my assignments were like that. There was no real reason why they went to me. And I should probably try to bear that in mind more often when I'm making assignments on my end. Sometimes it's much more interesting to give someone something that's really pretty off-center, because there's no way I couldn't approach any of those books with an agenda. I had none. I mean, I once got a book that was about a person learning to drive for the first time in her 50s. I got another book about a woman, the woman to bring home the first panda from China to the United States. I got Jane Austen's Guide to Dating. I mean, I just got these like completely different books. Like that, there was one of them I remember Dwight assigned me, and it was right after my second child was born. I shouldn't even say it was a book. It was a political and economic sort of treatise written by an academic, a sociologist, and and I absolutely hated it. It was basically a book that was sort of decrying what was wrong with consumer America, and I basically agreed with everything that he wrote, but I still hated it. And I remember, you know, I sent my review into to Dwight, and I said, you know, look, I'm in a situation here where I've got like a 3-week-old baby who's, you know, not sleeping. And so I'm not sleeping. And I just want to make sure that I, you know, take it all out on this book unfairly. And, you know, Dwight was like, no, absolutely not. It was right on. But anyway, I liked getting those unexpected assignments.
Wonderful. So I have one last question that I'll ask. And so it's to quote you, Pamela, you said criticism is an art form. And that same goes for editing and reviewing. So what is the one muscle that you, both of you, find yourself working on day after day, review after review, critique after critique? What's something that you'll never stop trying to be better at?
You want to take it, Pamela?
You know, wow. I mean, I would say that one thing is I'm very easily influenced. I'm an almost like a knee-jerk mimic. I can convince someone that I can speak a language of just knowing 5 words, because I'll say it, you know, with such conviction. And I think that that can go into my writing in an extent where I sort of have to take out whatever I've been reading or someone's voice in my head. I have to kind of force it out and remind myself, like, this is my thing, this is what I do. So I'm sort of constantly trying to get rid of tics that I've picked up from my incessant reading.
I think for me, I want to express, you know, I mean, I hope my reviews are smart and I hope my opinions are good. I want to express a certain amount of delight when I write. You know, I love what I do. I love the world. I love, you know, I love good prose more than anything. And when I read something great, there's nothing more fun than to single out the great sentences. I enjoy being a good quoter. I respect good quoter. Matter of fact, here's my book. I have a book coming out of quotations, of my favorite quotations, which are sort of unusual quotations and not the typical ones. And I appreciate writers who quote, interestingly, don't use the same old quotes. There's the maybe 30 quotes we seem to read over and over again from the same 25 people. And I enjoy good quoters as critics. I don't know, I want readers to look forward to reading my work and to enjoy it.
Wonderful. Well, I just want to once again thank you for joining us tonight. This really was an honor to get to do this digitally with you guys. As Laura mentioned in your intros, we're over the moon and beyond impressed that we were able to lure you both here today and to be a part of a Library Society event. And we really are lucky to have you both. So thank you. I know we're past our time limit, and I see our numbers have stayed strong, so everybody has enjoyed this conversation. So I just, one more time, I'd like to thank you. If we were in a room, there'd be a round of applause, but with Zooms and everybody muted, we just have the silent thank yous and the ASL for
it was fun. Thank you.
I was going to say, next time I'd love to be in Charleston.
Yeah, so we will invite you back as soon as we get those numbers down and it's safe to gather again. So we will definitely have you and host you again. So thank you, and have a wonderful evening.
All right. Good night.
Night.
Night, night.